It's Drakken on Super NES Works Episode 7. Over its lifetime, the Super NES developed a reputation as a breeding ground for incredible role-playing games. In practice, the console didn't see that many RPGs in the US, and the ones that showed up over here weren't exactly chart toppers in terms of sales. Still, I think there's something to this reputation. Certainly the NES was where I went from being someone who occasionally played RPGs but eyed the genre with suspicion, into a die-hard obsessive, and I've known many other people who shared a similar experience. I think the key to unraveling this notion requires you to look east, to Japan, where the RPG caught on in a major way during the 8-bit era thanks to the likes of Dragon Quest. That fanaticism carried directly through into the 16-bit era, and perhaps more than any other genre outside of something like racing, RPGs benefited from the greater memory capacity and processing power of these next-generation systems. Japanese RPGs struggled to move beyond merely imitating Dragon Quest Ultima and Wizardry on Famicom. But on Super Famicom, they began to diversify, to explore new mechanics, to break from the grind-driven design and plotting simplicity imposed by 8-bit limitations. And we'll look at the beginnings of that transformation in a few episodes when we get to the revolution of RPG design that was Final Fantasy IV. For the moment, however, we need to spend some time with the first RPG to make its way to Super NES. And it's something else entirely. For one thing, Drakken isn't a Japanese RPG. Yes, this version was developed and published by Japanese corporation Kemco Seika, but as with much of Kemco's output on NES and Game Boy, they adapted it from a Western property. In this case, it's a direct conversion of an RPG created by French developer Infogrames, which operates under the name Atari these days. Drakken made its debut on Amiga and Atari ST in 1989, and the Super NES conversion was the game's sole appearance on consoles. It's a strange, opaque RPG. Drakken wouldn't be the only Western CRPG conversion to appear on Super NES, but it surely must be the most unintuitive. You can't accuse the game of lacking ambition, though. Drakken gives the players an open-world, real-time, role-playing adventure viewed through free-scrolling 3D graphics. It's kind of amazing for a work of this vintage. Most people point to Bethesda's Terminator from 1990 as the first pioneering 3D open-world sandbox game, but here's Drakken hailing from 1989. In practice, Drakken's world is a long way from Elder Scrolls or Fallout, though. It's a fairly small world, divided into 4 zones, and it's pretty much utterly barren. The world's few points of interest appear on the in-game map, and most of them amount to houses where the visuals cut away and you're given a line or two of dialogue. Sometimes you'll encounter traveling merchants, but it always seems to happen at random, and the one permanent shop in the game isn't marked on the map. Each zone runs parallel, west to east, and each one contains 2 castles and a single healing shrine. The game largely consists of traveling from one castle to the next, where you encounter one of the royal dragonmen who give the game its title. They dispense quests and send you wandering back and forth to trigger dialogue events. You spend the majority of the game slogging through the overworld, which contains all sorts of annoying hazards. For example, water dots the landscape, especially in the swamp zone, and your party runs the risk of drowning if they fall in as you travel. Random encounters crop up all throughout your quest, even while you're standing still. At any point in the overworld, you can be attacked by roaming monsters. These encounters really help pad out the playing time, not because they're especially difficult or time-consuming, but because they're so wildly random in their outcomes. Battles play out automatically, and you have only a slim handful of skills available: auto attack, cast healing or offensive magic, or defend. Since you have very little control over your party's actions, battles can go incredibly well or quite poorly, and there's no real way to affect it or to track how effectively you're attacking, except by listening to combat sound effects. Sometimes you'll land a critical hit and a battle will end within seconds. Other times, however, your party will manage to whiff every attack, and a mundane, low-level enemy encounter will absolutely demolish your team. That's where the padding comes in. Restorative powers are insanely expensive, especially in the early portions of the game, so when a character falls, you need to hoof it to the Anak healing shrines for a free resurrection. Again, there's only one Anak shrine per zone, so a single character's death means you need to drop everything and trudge to the nearest one, pummeling the LNR triggers rapidly to effect an escape anytime a monster gets a jump on your diminished party. And traveling is no breezy venture either. Besides the random monster attacks and deadly pools of water, you also have to worry about annoying inconveniences. There's no easy way to orienteer your party since the flat, featureless world lacks long-range landmarks, and you can only see the compass rose that displays the direction you're currently facing by switching to the map screen. The game's interface is pretty terrible all around. I assume it probably played better on systems with keyboards and mice, but on Super NES you're stuck with a 6-button controller and a whole lot of cumbersome menus and icons. Modern interface niceties we take for granted in RPGs, such as descriptive text for items, and any indication whatsoever of how equipping a piece of gear will affect your stats, simply don't exist here. Drakken feels caught in many ways between the minimalist hostility of vintage CRPGs and the seamless style of modern role-playing. It's an awkward place to be. On the other hand, the befuddling opacity of Drakken sometimes works in its favor. The parsimony with which dialogue is delivered makes for a story that leaves you more or less in the dark about the nature of the world and why these giant royal dragons who hate men seem cool with you wandering into their homes, and it creates an air of mystery about the adventure. That's only enhanced by deliberate creative choices. Sometimes the priests at the Anak shrines will deliver helpful advice, but sometimes they simply chant at you. Every once in a while, the night sky will come alive and a constellation will take physical form, swooping down to attack. And then there are the bizarre dog things that appear if you touch one of the glyphs that litter the overworld. What purpose they serve is, to my knowledge, never explained, but once their giant heads appear, your party is basically dead within a matter of seconds. All of these elements add up to give Drakken a cryptic air to a degree that you almost never experience in modern games. Nowadays, games are built on principles like good design and positive user experiences, and something as naive and often hostile as Drakken would never fly. It even has equipment that breaks forever at random, something that sends modern gamers into paroxysms of rage. But there is a lot to like about the game, even if it doesn't quite gel. Much of the real meat of the game transpires in an adventure game like Side View. You talk to characters, explore rooms, collect keys, use the look icon to examine things, and so forth. When Final Fantasy VII made its way to personal computers in the late 90s, a common thread of criticism among PC-centric reviewers was that Final Fantasy VII and other Japanese RPGs weren't real RPGs, but more like adventure games. As we see with Drakken, a game designed in Europe for computers, these genres are cousins at the very least, if not siblings. This is the kind of game that, like many others of its era, doesn't lend itself to quick, efficient play. You're meant to wander around, get lost, grind for experience while trying to unravel its secrets. It's the kind of game designed for an era when most people bought games in small numbers, infrequently, and really had to commit to them. Even putting aside its primitive graphics and user interface, it doesn't hold up that well 25 years later, where games are plentiful, cheap, accessible, and reveal their workings to players easily. Personally, I regret that I didn't have a better grasp on the workings of RPGs when I first experienced Drakken back in the day. For a kid who had only played a handful of console RPGs and picked up the game as a weekend rental, Drakken was simply too opaque and too steeped in the standoffish design of 80s CRPGs for me to properly grasp. These days, given infinite time, I could definitely see myself digging into Drakken and trying to unravel its workings. It's an interesting outlier in the annals of Super NES RPG history. As a final interesting footnote, it seems the distinction of being the Super NES's first RPG release worked somewhat in Drakken's favor. Infogrames never followed up on this bizarre creation, but Kemco did. Several years later, they created their own sequel to Drakken called Dragon View. The original Drakken, however, remains a journey completed only by the most determined of console RPG fans. The Super NES would eventually play host to dozens of far less cryptic role-playing games that looked and played nothing at all like Drakken. Even Dragon View itself doesn't have much in common with its predecessor. Still, you can see this attempt to break the RPG away from the hoary old dungeons and top-down views of computer RPGs as a first halting step toward the likes of Skyrim. Like so many experimental evolutionary efforts, it may not hold up well, but it offers much for game history enthusiasts to admire, ideally from a safe distance. Next on Super NES Works, we shoot 'em up again, slowly.